Today is Monday, December 12th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When I decided to leave my private school teaching position and start the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, just about everyone, including my wife, thought I was nuts. No one thought that I would find any interest in the classical liberal arts, in the curriculum that was studied throughout church history by wise men and saints. And yet I knew that it was necessary to restore it. And I had a confidence that it would be successful. In order to test this confidence I had, I decided to subject my decision to the church. And so I contacted the diocesan office and asked if I could discuss the plan I had with the bishop, and the bishop agreed to have his vicar of education meet with me. And so I had a couple of meetings with the vicar of education, introduced myself, explained what I hoped to do, and asked for counsel. And after at least 2 meetings, the vicar of education encouraged me to go for it. And he even encouraged me to consider starting an independent Catholic school. And so I had my confidence affirmed by the encouragement and support of the church. And I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy back in September 2008. And 14 years later, it continues to grow. Now, the mere existence of the academy, to me, is impressive enough, but what's been even more impressive to me as I've sort of managed this thing through the years is that I've found beyond my expectations that the curriculum studied by the wise men and saints throughout church history has absolutely no problem in the modern world. Of my own children, my oldest 3 easily moved on from classical Catholic studies into their adult college and vocational activities. The oldest 3 chose to join the military and are currently in college studies. 2 of them are ROTC cadets, and the 3rd is just getting started. But they had no problem moving from a classical Catholic study program into modern vocations. And while I was, just speaking honestly as a father, I was personally disappointed that my oldest children didn't pursue more of a religious or contemplative vocation. I'm very proud of them in what they're doing. But what was most amazing to me was that I had never given any thought of them moving into secular occupations, and yet they did so without any trouble whatsoever. In fact, they enjoy many advantages. Advantages that I never even imagined because I wasn't preparing the kids for the path that they chose. Early on, my work in the academy was criticized by parents who were anxious and who had no way to possibly envision what would develop. And I remember one parent in particular saying, well, the CLAA is fine if you're interested in religious vocations, but it's not good if you're thinking about a secular vocation. And I would have agreed with that. And at the time, I agreed. I said, that's true. If you're interested in preparing for a secular vocation, it doesn't make much sense to study the classical liberal arts. And yet, now that my own children have actually chosen to pursue secular vocations, I've seen that even in that, I was wrong. That there's absolutely no justification for neglecting the classical Catholic curriculum, even if a student does choose to pursue a secular vocation. So I admit that in the beginning, when I was getting started, I underestimated the classical liberal arts. I thought that they would be of interest to people or to students preparing for religious vocations, but I didn't think there would be any reason for students to study them who would just go on to secular vocations, but I was wrong about that. As I said, my children easily moved into secular vocations in the military and in modern university studies with no trouble, moving from a classical Catholic study program to their chosen vocations. And I'm very happy that I gave them a classical Catholic education for as long as I had the opportunity to do so. And I believe that they enjoy many benefits because of that education they received. And if I would have known in advance that my children would have chosen secular vocations, I might have chosen to give them a different education, and I would have regretted doing so. And I think that there are many Catholic parents who are trying to predict the future for their children's lives. And as they try to predict the future, they have negative thoughts. And so they make decisions on the children's education that denies them the opportunity to study the classical Catholic curriculum. And this is really unfortunate. After all, if we Catholics don't study and preserve the classical Catholic curriculum, no one will. If we Catholics don't study and preserve the classical Catholic curriculum, no one will. And if you're thinking that your children can't study it or won't like it because they're interested in modern things, I can tell you, based on my 14 years of experience running the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, that those thoughts are false. Those negative thoughts are false. And so many parents have chosen to go in another direction, and they've left off classical Catholic studies, or they've gone after fake classical Catholic studies, which is even worse. And they've simply lost a generation where their families could have moved closer to traditional Catholic education and begun to enjoy the benefits and make preparations for the next generation. Instead, they've simply chosen to shrink back to the modern curriculum and settle for the minimum standards for another generation, thinking that doing so is necessary because they might choose a secular vocation. And for the sake of that secular vocation, which they're not even sure of, they've chosen to give their children no philosophical studies, no theological studies, very little of the essential studies of the classical liberal arts. And so they're almost establishing a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're setting their children up to be secular-minded men and women, rather than using their years of influence to immerse their children in classical Catholic studies, to take with them and influence them and speak to them in whatever course of life they later choose as adults. And so this anxiety about the future is actually causing Catholic parents to sacrifice their opportunity to influence their children because they're trying to predict the future and they're anxious about the future. Now, why would I choose to pursue this course if it's so uncertain? And there's a very important reason why I chose this course. As I look around, I see countless unhappy Catholic people. I see Catholic people really upset and angry and frustrated, constantly complaining about the church. And yet when we look at their education, how they educate their children, what they do for a living and so on, we find that these people who are constantly complaining about the Catholic Church and their Catholic lives and their kids and schools, on and on, they're not giving their children the education that's recommended to them by the wise men and saints of history. They themselves, as adults, are not studying the subjects that the wise men and saints have counseled them to study. And I just look and I say, how can you expect to be happy as Catholics when you talk about the saints and then don't listen to their counsel? Don't imitate their lives. I don't understand how Catholics can think that something good and beautiful and different is going to come out of another generation where the Catholics choose to do the same foolish things. Racked with anxiety about the world, ignoring the counsel and example of the saints and following unbelievers because they're concerned about some uncertain secular occupation. I don't understand how Catholics can expect for anything to get better. Rather than saying, well, there are no religious vocations these days, why not ask, maybe there are no religious vocations these days because we're not following the example or counsel of the wise men and saints. Maybe that's part of the problem. Why would we expect religious vocations from kids whose education is handed over to secular influences rather than subjected to the counsel and example of wise men and saints of church history? I think we're getting what we deserve, and we're repeating it for another generation. The same problems, same excuses, Same low standards, same neglect, same laziness for another generation. And that's our choice. We've chosen to perpetuate these problems for the next generation. Now, when I was making decisions about the education of my children, I refused to do that. I don't know why Catholic people find unbelievers so worthy of imitation. I look at the world and I think the world is full of foolishness. I don't care what the world does. I don't care what the world says is important. I don't care what the world says is necessary for future preparation. I don't think the world knows the answer to these questions. And Psalm 1 tells me that I shouldn't be listening to the world on these issues. And so when I dig open the writings and histories of the saints and what Catholic doctors and wise men of the past did, I believe that they have the answers not just for their generation, but for all time. Because our children's nature is not different than the nature of children who lived in past generations. The end of our children's lives is not different than it was for children in past generations. And if these things are true, why would the education be different from the education that the saints received from the wise men who taught them? I don't believe it should be different. And when the saints, through their writings, which were intended for future generations, not for their generation, they weren't writing these things for their own peers. They were writing them for us, just as the sacred scriptures were written, that we, through the comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. St. Paul said explicitly what was written before was written for our sake. It wasn't written for the past generation. It was written for us, to counsel and teach us. And we simply don't listen to it, because the world tells us, that was true for them, but that's not true for us. Well, who says so? We say so. We're the ones who are saying that the counsel of the ancients is not for us. No one else said that. We said that. We practice that. We decide that their counsel is not for us because we're crazy. We're crazy. We look at the example in the lives of the saints and we scoff at it like it's outdated and obsolete because we're crazy. And then we wonder why things are so upside down. We imagine, we tell ourselves that we're not like the world. We're different from the world. We tell ourselves that, and yet when we look around, we find that we're just like the world. We're doing the same things. We're seeking the same things. We're studying the same subjects and books. And yet we've got ourselves deceived to think that we're different when we're doing the same things. Sure, on Sunday, our Sunday routine may look different. We get up and get dressed and go to a church, and many of our neighbors don't do that. But Monday through Saturday, most of what we do is indistinguishable from what unbelievers do, especially when it comes to education. Especially, and we can try to pretend we're doing something different. We can say, well, we don't use a secular study program. We use a Catholic study program. Yeah, but the principles of that Catholic study program are secular. It's not even based on anything from church history or from any council of any doctors of the church. It's a secular study program that's simply wrapped in Catholic appearances. It's the same study program. The same study program that's being used by unbelievers dressed up to pretend it's something else. It's absolutely nothing like the study program that was known to saints and wise men in history. And so even though it may appear different from a modern study program, it's essentially the same. And yet, it's essentially different from the study programs of wise men and saints. Now, for me, I trust the saints. I trust the saints even if I have to do it by myself, even if I have to go on a path that no one else goes. I don't trust the path that everyone else is on because I see the results. I trust the path that I read of and see in the lives and writings of the saints. And they taught and studied the classical liberal arts, scholastic philosophy, and Catholic theology exactly as we teach them in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And people can look and say, well, this looks very strange. I think we'll just stick with our other programs. But what are we saying? We're saying the curriculum of the wise men and saints is unfamiliar to me, and I'm going to stick with the modern secular curriculum that I'm familiar with. And this is what Catholic parents are doing. They don't trust the counsel and the example of saints. They don't trust it. They don't like it. They're more comfortable walking in the counsel of the ungodly, literally fulfilling what's said in Psalm 1. And if you don't know what Psalm 1 says, hit the pause button and go look it up in your Catholic Bible. They're walking in the counsel of the ungodly, doing exactly what the psalm tells us not to do. And what does the psalm say? It says that those who do that are like chaff. They're like dried up dead leaves and branches that the wind blows away. They have no substance. There's no life in them. They're worthless. They're blown away in the wind. Jesus used a similar image when he taught that Christians are the salt of the earth. But if we lose our saltiness, that is, if we're no longer different, if we're no longer like salt, then we're useless. He said also, the Christians are the light of the world. Well, that assumes that the world is darkness and the Christians are different. They're different. They're the opposite. The world is dark. The Christians are shining like lights in the world. And if we look around, are the Christians today like lights and like salt? Or are they without salt? Are they like lights covered up that give no light? The answer is pretty obvious. What we see in modern Catholic society is exactly what Jesus warned of. When the Catholics live in fear of the world, doubting saints and wise men, and trusting unbelievers. This is what it means to walk in the counsel of the ungodly. This is what modern Catholic schools have done. This is what modern Catholic homeschool parents have done. When was the last time you heard a secular college or university or school say, we need to follow the Catholics? Their schools and study programs and achievements are amazing. We need to follow the Catholics. We never hear that. We never hear that because the Catholics have lost their saltiness. They're no longer like lights shining in the darkness. How then can we become like salt and light in the world? There's no place more obvious than in education. And in order to do that, in order to be that, there has to be something different. And what can it be? What can it be that's different? Not just different for the sake of being different, but actually different in that it's better, it's superior, it's wiser. How can we be not just different, but actually be salt and light? The answer is we can restore classical Catholic studies for our children. We can return to the education of the wise men and saints in a miserable, hopeless generation that Catholics are still afraid of, even as they watch it go on deeper and deeper into misery. If our society was thriving, we might understand why Catholics would be afraid to stand out or take a different course. We could understand that. But in this generation, there's no excuse. It can't be explained why in the world Catholics are afraid of taking a different course, a course that's better, a course that's thoroughly Catholic, that's wiser, that's recommended to them by wise men and saints. There's no way we can explain why Catholics don't do this. We have to work to restore classical Catholic education. We have to enroll our children, and this may sound shameless, but Catholic children need to study in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's the only place where they have access to these studies. And I'll say that very boldly and confidently because it's the truth. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is the only place where Catholic children in 2022 can study the system of arts and sciences that was studied and taught by history's wise men and saints and was counseled by them for us to study. It's the only place. We can be salt and light. We can change these things. We can do better. And even, you may think, well, what if our kids still choose a secular vocation? I can tell you in my own kids' lives, other people know that they're different. Because even though I might say, and again, I'm just being honest, I might say, I'm personally disappointed in the paths that they've chosen because I know the potential that they had, and I was more confident in them than they were in themselves. And they've chosen paths that I consider to be less than their potential. And yet the people in those fields see my kids as extraordinary. Even though they have chosen secular careers, they stand out. They stand out for their innocence. They stand out for the strength and support they have from their family. They stand out for their work ethic. They stand out for their ability to study and learn and manage stressful challenges. They stand out. And they're given honors and opportunities that are made possible by their Christian education and Christian spirit, whether they fully embrace it or not. It's in them, and it causes them to differ. And my kids had a hard time because they were like guinea pigs working with me as I was criticized on all sides and doubted on all sides. And I don't pretend to be surprised that my kids struggled to trust me. And yet now that they've been through it all and have moved on to adult life, they know that everything is fine, that all the excuses are false, that everything turned out fine, and they lacked nothing, and they entered into adult life with many advantages, and could have had more had they given themselves more fully to the classical Catholic studies they were provided with. My younger children are growing up in very different circumstances. All of that initial doubt and uncertainty is unknown to them. And they're much further along at their younger ages than my older children were, because my older children were waiting for me to put the materials together, and my younger children have the opportunity to just plow through them. And this is what I would recommend to Catholics. Get your kids started, because it makes a change in the direction of your family. Get your kids started, whatever age they may be. Get them started. Make a change in your family. Maybe this first generation will only make a little bit of progress, but the foundation will be prepared for the next generation. The next generation will have the entire Classical Liberal Arts Academy curriculum available and can hit the ground running because you've already gotten started. You're going to be a grandparent, not just a parent. And maybe by getting your kids started in the studies of wise men and saints and gaining some experience and getting familiar with things, studying it yourself, you can make yourself useful to your grandchildren or to other people's children to help restore real Catholic education. Like I said, even my expectation of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy turned out to be less than the reality is showing itself to be. We can satisfy modern standards because they're very low. But we can exceed them not by adding more modern studies, but by studying the courses and subjects that are recommended to us by the saints. And if we don't do this, if we don't give our children the education recommended by wise men and saints, I don't know what we're doing. What are we doing? We're simply following in the counsel of the ungodly, and that will explain everything we see around us as Catholics living in the 21st century.